That day, when 375 German planes came roaring up the Thames River, the Battle of Britain became the Battle of London. Heroes of the night were men of the London Fire Brigade who stretched temporary hose lines out to the center of the Thames River, struggling through mud and slime. For the Nazis had carefully picked a night on which the Thames River had one of the lowest ebb tides on record.
The evidence of London at war is still to be found at low tide along the banks of the River Thames, from the heart of the City of London right up to the Thames estuary where I am today, in the form of bullets, shrapnel, military buttons and cap badges, and even unexploded grenades and bombs. Despite the sustained aerial bombing campaign of the Luftwaffe in World War II, the only British territory to be occupied were the Channel Islands. The legacy of that difficult time is still visible today in the form of the reinforced concrete bunkers dotted around the coastline. In 2021, I travelled to Guernsey and I spoke with several people who told me their childhood memories and their stories of life under the German occupation in World War II.
Seeing Germans was a different story. My mother was really scared of Germans because we'd heard so much of the trouble in France, so it was frightening for everyone. They wanted accommodation and they were looking at different places either in the town close by or with views, and we had a lovely view of the harbour and the islands and the sea, and they wanted to come. They arrived, and my mother and I followed them up the stairs. And when they came down, they were saying, schön, ja, good, as what to say, yes, this will suit us. And my mother, she went and fell between their boots in the passageway, and she was moaning and groaning, and I said, Mum, what's the matter? And she said, oh, shut up. She said, I'm all right. And the Germans thought she was really ill because she was putting on such a pace, and they said, oh, yeah, and they went off. They didn't understand at all. They only spoke German at the time. So that was the first time they came. And they never came back. Those didn't, but we did have 2 searches after from Germans.
They were here about, 5-6 years? I first saw my German underneath a water tank with a machine gun.
I was almost 9, coming up in the August. So it did change because a lot of our friends had left to be evacuated at the time. So many, and we had to go to different schools, so we lost a lot of our friends at school. We didn't know at the time because it was just headlines on the Guernsey paper saying that people had to register that night and children were having to go. This was 1940 in June, 19th of June, and in 2 days half of the population, 20,000, left by boat, and quite a few children went, and about 1,000, over 1,000 stayed. So most of them left with the school children, yes.
That was 5 years. When they came back, they weren't recognised. They spoke in a different language almost. It was Yorkshire accent. And their parents didn't recognise these tall, lanky things.
How did you feel about staying behind on the island?
Well, my grandfather had been born in the house that we were living, and he was determined the Germans weren't going to take his house and come and take him away or anything. He'd been born there, and he said, "Now the Jerrys are not coming. I'm going to stay here, whatever happens." So in 2 days, they all went, and then within a week, we had the bombing raid, which was frightening in itself. So good job in a way that some of the children had left, yes.
I asked Dad what was the war like, and he said it was a bit boring. You can imagine 5 weeks, 5 months, but 5 years under the Germans. It was a bit boring. Remember, curfew was at 6, so you couldn't go out in the evenings or couldn't go next door to chat. No TV, no radio. Yes, so we really looked forward to Sundays and church, and where we could see our friends again. And in the end, he started up a little choir and went round Guernsey in a horse and cart, of course, and singing to anyone who'd listen almost during the day.
My father had a radio, but he put it in a coffin because a friend of his ran a place and he hid it in a coffin. My grandfather hid a gun, which was far worse, because all the guns and everything had to be handed in straight away the next day. And he didn't tell my mother, didn't tell my father, and of course that was difficult, because when they came to search, it wasn't till after they'd gone and they hadn't found anything. My grandfather said, "Oh, I better go and check and see if the gun is still there in the barrel in the backyard," which he did. I mean, this is the frightening part, and my father was quite annoyed to think he would do that without telling my father. That was guns. You couldn't keep radios either, but they were hidden in so many different places. So it was very difficult, you know. Most people made little crystal sets, and they were smaller. And those were brilliant.
It was all about getting the British news, because being cut off from England, and you know, everything was short, including the news. So for most of the time, radios were confiscated, and it was illegal, according to the Germans, to have them. So if people did use a radio or crystal set, which there were many of, which a lot of people made to obtain the news, there could have been dire consequences. There was, you know, threatening of deportation or even being shot if it was bad, if it was severe, you know, could have been rather nasty, but I don't think it got quite that bad. But my parents had a crystal set, here it is, and made by a friend of theirs, also called the Cat's Whiskers. They used to tune in. I believe there was also an aerial outside the back. They had to make sure it wasn't seen by the Germans who were around here, I believe, quite a lot. But they used to pick up the British news, and my mother was working for the bailiff, who is our head of the whole island, really. My mother started at the bailiff's office, I think about 1942. She had previously worked at the Guernsey Star printing firm when my father was the State's printer. She was a proofreader, but as we were cut off from England, there were no books coming to proofread. I don't know who suggested it, for her to take the British news to our bailiff. She must have agreed. I don't know if she saw the danger in it then, but they would have written the news down here from this crystal set in longhand, and then she, on her bicycle, She told me in late life she hid the news sheets in her clothes somewhere, cycled to work. When she got there, she was gone up to the office and sat down and typed it out. Well, she did have a scary moment once when a German came in the wrong room, but he was quickly ushered to another room. So obviously he didn't know what she was typing. But then that's how the bailiff would have received the news. The thing is, these news sheets couldn't be kept lying around because, you know, so they had to be destroyed, because if anyone had found them who shouldn't have found them, there would have been very severe, dire consequences, which I dread to think. All the important people and all my family and everything, they would have been made to suffer.
So then, you'd mentioned earlier that some of the news was then typed out on the wrapping paper of tomatoes.
Yes. Now this was the main gentleman who started the Guernsey Secret Press. He was a Mr. Ludovic Bertrand, and he lived up a Longstall area, which is on the seafront near St John's Church. He was a very brave man, and it was his idea, I think, to start all this group. He started with a very small radio, I believe. He'd probably made himself somehow. And he used to write the news in longhand. And there were Germans all around that area, in buildings and everything. A man who worked close by in what was then the Fruit Export Company, he became aware of all this, I suppose, and perhaps Mr. Bertrand asked him if he could help, and he used to type Mr. Bertrand's news on tomato packing paper. This was because, being cut off from England, there were no supplies, you know, nothing really, essential commodities, anything. That's why some of our men had to go to France to buy food and all sorts there. But this Mr. Bertrand was a very, very brave man, and the sheets that his friend Mr. Worley had typed would have been taken to the shops along that area, especially Mr. Mullin's cycle shop. And then once people got to know where the news was, they used to very carefully, I should think, go and pick up a sheet for themselves to read and to distribute to other people. And that, I believe, is the main way, as far as I know, that a lot of the islanders got their news all over Guernsey. Even the slave workers, I believe, somehow got the news from this group.
So your parents were members of GASP,
yes,
as well. Did they ever talk to you about it when you were young?
Not much. I mean, they never made anything much of it. But certainly Richard Hume at the Island Museum, the German Occupation Museum he made a lot of it, and he asked her to talk. And, you know, it was quite dangerous, like, thinking back. And there were dozens of men, mostly men, some women, who, you know, undertook distributing the news. There were growers, there were doctors, police, St John Ambulance, parish constables, fishermen, all sorts of people, barbers, hairdressers, people working at the Guernsey Press Company, growers, printers. My father's printer at the Guernsey Star Printing Company, all sorts, a radio maker, crystal set makers, shopkeepers, all sorts. And several of the agents were in our St John's Church, which I still go to, and a lot of them were in the church choir, so they distributed the sheets. I should think the Germans wouldn't have thought at all that anyone from a church choir would have distributed the British news. But anyway, they were all very brave. But
so many people, like normal, ordinary people,
yes,
who were so brave.
Yes, well, I suppose they all worked well together, and they didn't let each other down. There must have been dozens of them.
And what would have been the repercussions if they had been caught, these people?
Well, when you think of the other group called GUNS, Guernsey Underground News Service, there were a few of those, and they were let down quite soon after they started distributing the news. An Irishman, I believe, let them down, and they were all sent away, and some of them died there somehow. They never came back. But
were they different organisations, they GUNS and GARS?
Yes, GUNS was a different one. GUNS originated from printers at the Guernsey Star, actually, when my father was working. So I don't know what he knew about it. Those poor men from GUNS, there weren't that many of them, I don't believe, but it's all in the books, the history books. And they felt some of them, a couple of them, I think, the families never knew where they were till most recently, when Dr. Gilly Carr helped and discovered a grave, or two graves, I think.
"1942 was our worst year. It was very bad. I remember when we used to have to scrounge, my sister and I, she was 2 years younger, and we used to go down and steal with the help from the Guernseymen, and they used to tip the barrels of potatoes, and we used to try and get them before they went into the gutters. We used to go under the bellies of the horses, but I was caught one day and chased and had a lovely kick, and I went home a little few in tears. And my father, he was so annoyed. He was going to get Otto, the German. He was going to fix him, but he was so big. My mother sort of cooled him down, but on the whole, the Germans are good and bad, like everybody, like every nation.
He also had to work for the Germans, and he worked in a food store where sugar was distributed, flour, all the heavy stuff. And one day, of course, he was a bit short of sugar and flour, so he just put some in his pockets. But a German friend, not a friend, but a German, said, "Oh, you're young and fit, let's have a boxing match." So Dad was a little worried that sugar would spill out, so he soon hit the floor. "Oh, you win, you win."
By 1944 was dreadful. We had no bread for 3 weeks, and that was the worst time. No gas, no electric, no water, no nothing, and the rations were twopence halfpenny for the week.
We had the Red Cross that showed up across the road to us. We lived on boiled leaves, cabbage leaves, or potato peelings.
When the beaches were sometimes open, I mean most times they were closed, they were out of bounds, with mines, 65,000 mines around the beaches on the island alone, 60,000 when you think, and they were allowed to go a certain time to get some seaweed, and it was dried and made into a powder and into sort of a jelly pudding. That was a change, and probably good for us, but we didn't know at the time, but yeah, we did enjoy that.
Most Germans were gentlemen over here. A relative of mine was carrying wood that she'd collected, and a German with a rifle said, "Stop!" She was petrified, of course. And he said, "That's no job for an old lady like you." And he put his rifle down, picked up the wood and carried it home for her. So they were kind-hearted.
We did have nice ones. We were asked, my sister and I, if we were hungry once in the road, and we were allowed to go where we shouldn't have, was out of bounds. up at the Coat Hills where there was there was a German club, and we had to go home and get a saucepan and a jug, and we could collect some soup. That was good Germans. Then other Germans came. The only time my mother had to face Germans at the door, they came and they wanted to leave photographs of my family that they found in a house nearby, 2 or 3 doors away, and they wanted my mother to look after them till after liberation, when the people came back from the UK. They spoke perfect English because they were going to Russia, and they was dreading going to Russia. We used to see them trying to fall over our wall to commit suicide, really, to injure themselves, so they couldn't get to Russia. It was, they feared, they knew they would never come back. So we thought those were good Germans as well. It was only a little sort of presence, but it was because they were a family in Germany, and they wanted to show some kindness there. That's how it was. I mean, there was a lot of people, older people on their own, that died of starvation. Really, I mean, they never put it on the accounts at the end, but they must have, because they had no one like my mother. She used to queue for hours, 2 or 3 hours every morning to try and feed. There was 8 of us. There was 6 men my mother had to look after, or promised. It was my uncles that couldn't look after themselves, so they were at the house as well. So it was a dreadful time. She was the angel, honestly. That's why I wrote the books, because she did everything for everybody, but she worked so hard to get food. That was all. And we used to walk to the country. Country people were better off than us. The town people had no gardens, so it was difficult, yeah. But she was brilliant, so that was why after the war it was always, you should write a book, lad, they'd say to my mother, but she never did. So I thought, well, I must do it for her, really. And liberation time, it's for my mother, really.
Oh, that's
And
wonderful.
it saddens me sometimes that she's still not here.
They suffered just as badly towards the end of the war, with shortages of food, and chickens would go missing, or a few potatoes from the back garden. It was quite a time.
When the Red Cross ship came, it was wonderful. I mean, we all went a bit mad for that, because we knew the parcels were there, food was there from the Red Cross. And to see the loaf after 3 weeks, I remember that more than the tin food, because to see a loaf, and it was beautiful, special bread, flour, oh, it was lovely.
It was not only the local people who endured hardship during the German occupation of Guernsey. During the war, the Germans transported over 16,000 slave workers to the Channel Islands to build fortifications, coastal defences, concrete bunkers, roads and tunnels under the supervision of Organisation Todt. Hitler wanted to turn the islands into an impregnable fortress, and for this he needed labourers to build his Atlantic wall. These slave labourers, many from Russia, Poland and Belarus, were treated with contempt. They had meagre rations, threadbare clothing, and were worked to exhaustion. the largest remaining structures from the occupation is the German Military Underground Hospital, with its network of tunnels covering 7,000 square metres. The tunnels were dug out by hundreds of slave workers of numerous nationalities, many of whom died during the tunnel's construction. Whilst in Guernsey, I met, quite by chance, Magda Royall, who told me about her father Jerzy Mroch, who was deported to Guernsey from Poland.
My dad was born in Poland. On the 1st of September, the Germans occupied Poland. My dad was in the Polish Navy. He would not fight for the Germans. So they put him in a concentration camp. He escaped, he got recaptured, and he got put in several others, including Stalag. The thing is that they ended up sending him to Guernsey for slave labour.
My name is Jerzy Mroch. I am a Polish national. I was born in September 1917 in Puck. My father was called Bernard, and my mother was called Matilda. Our family name is Rabokowski. In 1933, I finished my 7th year at school in Puck. I lived at my parents' home until 1937. That same year I joined the Polish Navy. When Germany invaded Poland on 1st September 1939, I fought against them with the Polish Navy in the September campaign. I was taken prisoner of war in 1939 at Oksywie and was incarcerated in the German prisoner of war camp Stalag B2. I was able to escape on 20th July, but I was captured and sent to Sztutowo prison. I was there for 10 months, and then I was transported to Gdańsk. From there I remained in prison at Schiffstange. From there I was transported back to Sztutowo. 3 months later I was transported again, eventually ending up at Berlin-Oranienburg. From there I was sent to work in France. Shortly after this, I was deported as forced labor to the island of Guernsey.
And then he met my mother, which is a Guernsey woman. They fell in love, and then he never went back to Poland, but he ended up having 7 children. And so we still carry on his name, the Polish name.
Oh,
so we're proud, that he survived the war.
That's amazing. And did he meet your mother after the war?
He did. He stayed in Guernsey with her, and then they eventually went to get married. They lived in the Boët in Guernsey, and then eventually they went up to England to work, where we followed them as well afterwards. And sadly he died around about 30 years ago, maybe a bit more.
Did he ever tell you anything about what it was like?
He was very secretive, because he couldn't even watch a war film because it used to affect him, and he used to cry. And he said, one day I'll tell you, but he never ever did. But I know he went through a lot. It affected him deeply.
After the war, Jerzy Mroch enlisted in the Polish Resettlement Corps Naval Wing, and he was also awarded the British War Medal.
We were at the top of the Sarge at St Peter's, and my father always took me to my grandmother, and he brought me back again across his crossbar. No cushion on the crossbar, and I saw these two jets follow one another and went down. So that's the Canadian fella. Plaque is over there. He's out there somewhere buried.
Yeah, somewhere out there the plane went down. It was just where that boat is, I suppose. I don't know if they ever found it. 1944.
Flight Lieutenant John Walton Saville of the Royal Canadian Air Force was killed on 5th of June 1944 during a mission to destroy the Freya radar at Fort George, Guernsey. It wasn't until the early 1970s that the site of the crash was finally located by divers. John Walton Saville is also commemorated on the Aircrew Memorial at Guernsey Airport. The memorial commemorates 153 Allied Air Force crewmen who lost their lives in the waters around Guernsey. The memorial incorporates a flight of Spitfires and a B-17, remembering the contribution of the United States Air Force. Just a short distance from John Walton Saville's memorial plaque is the slipway on St Peter Port Harbour, where Allied troops landed to liberate Guernsey on 9th of May 1945.
If you'd like to know how we got up at 6 o'clock in the morning after Churchill said our dear Channel Islands would be freed at 3 p.m. And at 6 o'clock in the morning, May the 8th, we got up, got down to the harbour in 5 minutes because we were so close. And we waited and waited for soldiers to come. And when they came, we just ran forward, knocked their hats off, their bayonets, everything, because there was only 25 of them, and Germans were still with us with their bayonets and guns. They were still walking around. But to see those soldiers so clean, it was wonderful. So we cried all day, I think, we sang. Met everybody that was coming into the town to celebrate. It was just a wonderful day, it really was.
Into the harbour of St Peter Port on Guernsey in the Channel Islands steams a British warship with the white ensign flying. A tumultuous welcome awaits the liberators of the islands. Incidentally, the oldest British possession and the only British territory to be occupied by the Germans during the war. The German guard marches out from the ancient castle. The German commander is marched away and all equipment is handed in.
I lost my mother, father, sister. I just went off on my own and got home about 9 o'clock in the evening with 2 biscuits all day. That's all I had. Didn't want anything else. Oh, I had an orange, but I didn't know how to manage it. So, no, it was a special day.
The Proclamation of Liberty is read and the Union Jack hoisted. With their rightful flag flying once again above them, the islanders give themselves over to Victory Day celebrations.
It must have been amazing having some chocolate after all that time, not having anything to
Well, that was
eat.
a luxury because we've never had tasted chocolate in our day. It was a square. You just put it in your mouth. Wow, that tasted lovely.
And then a few weeks later, their Majesties, the King and Queen, came to visit their dear islands. The visit to Guernsey, which was made by air, was the Queen's first official flight.
It was Hitler's little fortress, really, a little part of Britain Hitler had. A fascinating time, but not a happy time.
Three little girls presented bouquets, tributes from the islands of Guernsey, Alderney and Sark.
My mother said it was like a dream, looking back. But I think they were so pleased at the end of the occupation that it was all over.
When I visit Guernsey now, as I often do, as I have family there, and I'm sitting on the beach, looking out over the sea, swimming and beachcombing without a care in the world, it's hard to imagine sometimes the harsh reality of what it must have been like to live there during the occupation of World War II. So I'm profoundly grateful to everyone who has shared their stories on this video so that I could learn more about it, so that you could learn more about it, and future generations too, so that we won't forget what happened there. The more I learned about the occupation, the more stories I wanted to include, like those of the 3 women who were deported to Auschwitz and who died there. Like the islanders who were sent to the German camp at Biberach, well over 800 of them. Like the brave woman Marie-Ozanne, who was a sergeant in the Salvation Army and who protested against the harsh treatment of slave labourers. And like the young man who was sentenced to 5 years hard labour and who never returned to his family. If you want to learn more about life under the German occupation, Molly Bier has written several books and she tells me about them here.
It was through my husband. He said, why don't you write it? He said, if you don't, somebody else will. And it was brilliant. That was a child's war. And then I went to Reflections of Guernsey, and then Occupation Life, which says about the evacuation, and A Time for Memories, which was the last one, when I met the soldiers that came, the ones that were left, that wanted to come and receive a medal from the States of Guernsey 50 years after liberation. And I saw them and met them. They come to my house, some of them. So 4 books. I think that's enough. And I've met so many people which still get in touch, and I got a letter there to post. I was invited to Germany to speak to some universities, and I stayed with this couple for 17, 18 days, and I went all over Germany with them, and it was a wonderful holiday, you know. So there was good and there was not so good. And since I've met and looked after Germans in my guest house when I had, after the war, when my daughters were growing up, and they were very nice. They were a bit ashamed, I think, of things, but now, no, everything is forgiven, and I'm sure rightly so.
Mary Sims, whose parents played such an important part in communicating the news to islanders during the war, belongs to the Occupation Society, and she would love to hear from you if you have any stories to do with the occupation that you can share.
By the way, if any of you out there know anything about Guernsey and the occupation, especially the Guernsey Secret Press, it would be really nice if you could contact us over here in Guernsey, the Occupation Society, just to let us know some of your information, stories about any of your families or colleagues who could tell us about distributing the British news in the occupation. Thank you.
Now I'm back in London now. As you can see, Canary Wharf is there in the background, and I'm standing on the banks of the Thames. The tide is on the way out, so this is where you can often find me as a Thames mudlark. I'm often looking for objects washed out by the tide. I then love to research the stories behind them. Now, unlike the River Thames, remnants of World War II rarely wash up on the beaches of Guernsey these days, and the mines have long since been cleared from the sea, luckily. But a few years ago, as I was beachcombing during a visit to my family in Guernsey, I came across this medal here on a small beach not very far from the harbour at St Sampson's. And it's a medal that commemorates the end of World War I and celebrates the peace that was declared. Now, of course, we will never know who received this medal and who lost it, who once held it. But one thing is for certain, whoever did receive this medal could never have imagined at that time that even then World War II was looming on the horizon and the hardships that the Channel Islands would endure. So I'd like to dedicate this video to all those people who shared their stories with me, to all those people who didn't get a chance to share their stories, and all those people whose stories we will never know about. Now, before leaving the island on that occasion and coming back home here to London, there was just one more place that I wanted to visit.
Fort George Military Cemetery contains war graves of both World Wars. There are 113 World War II graves, and 111 of these belong to German soldiers who died during the occupation.
Behind this plaque, nobody really realises that all the names of the German soldiers who are buried here are recorded inside this little gate.
Gosh, look at that. So those are all the German soldiers that died here during the occupation.
That is correct, yeah.
And there's 111 of them.
Indeed. And also on the other side of the plaque.
So many of them died during the occupation, 111. How did they die?
Natural causes, obviously, in 5 years. There'd be suicides, and there'll be the occasional bombing raids on the radar installations and so on. That's it.
In 2018, a small group of German soldiers were invited to join British soldiers to repair and restore graves at the cemetery. It was the first time that German military have been in uniform on the island since the occupation during the Second World War.
Do you think it made you stronger as a person living through such a terrible time?
Probably. I mean, we don't waste a thing. I don't. Our age group doesn't. And I suppose stronger. I don't know. I just love people anyway. And we were so close, everybody, trying to be helpful. So I suppose it just stems from that, and we were a happy family despite everything. We used to play the piano, play cards, because we couldn't go out, but it was, I think I was born just at a lucky time because we came through it, and we love freedom, and I think that's why we appreciate life so much now. And my thoughts are always with my family.